The old pickup truck shuddered to a halt on a logging track that had seen no maintenance crew in at least a decade. Elias Vance, 40 years old and wearing a worn denim jacket that seemed to absorb the memory of every damp morning, killed the engine and let the silence settle. This September air was thick, heavy, and absorbed sound entirely, a damp blanket thrown over the world. It felt like being submerged in dark, cooling water. He stood 20 miles deep in the county's woods, far past the firebreak roads and the no trespassing signs that were riddled with bullet holes. The air here held a deep, specific smell. The rich, fertile decay of ancient pine needles mingling with the metallic, powdery scent of mineral dust kicked up by his tires. It was an odor that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades, a smell he had attempted to scrub out of his memory with therapy, alcohol, and the insistent rhythm of rescue work in places far away. Elias had served as a search and rescue specialist for 15 years, pulling people out of canyons and off flooded riverbanks. He was methodical and detached, the sort of man who looked at a crushed femur or a hypothermic body and saw only a problem to be solved, not a tragedy to be wept over. He returned to this place not to find anything, but to prove that nothing remained. He intended to dismantle the nightmares piece by brutal piece, until all that remained was the sensible geology of the land. He stepped out, the ground spongy under his hiking boots. The softness felt unnatural, eager to swallow the sound of his movements. He spent the first 2 days setting up a simple camp, meticulously checking his gear, his shortwave radio, and the heavy pistol he brought. Not for anything specific, he affirmed, but for bears. This was prime black bear country, and a man alone needed protection. By the 3rd night, the clouds had thickened, filtering the moonlight to a weak, watery glow. Elias lay inside his tent, staring up at the synthetic ceiling, listening to the absolute perfect lack of sound. This quiet was the most unnerving aspect of the place. Deep forests generate background noise, the movement of air, the rustle of mice, the distant hoot of an owl. This part of the county was dead quiet. Then the silence broke. It was not a sharp crack or a sudden cry. It was a sound that traveled less through the air and more through the solid ground, vibrating into his chest cavity. A low, rhythmic resonance, like a deep-sea creature clicking or 2 colossal stones being slowly, inexorably ground against each other. It was infrasound, a noise below the threshold of typical human hearing, but his body registered it with a panicked jolt. The resonance was measured, slow, and devastatingly heavy. Elias sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. A sudden cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The grinding lasted perhaps 20 seconds, then ceased, replaced by the same suffocating silence. He forced himself to believe it was a shift in the bedrock or a far-off industrial pump. But the sound had been too organic, too slow, and too purposeful. He fumbled for his powerful, light-emitting diode lantern and stepped outside. The cold September air hit him, instantly cooling the sweat. He stood near the dead campfire pit, shining the beam into the wall of pines. Nothing moved, just the endless ranks of black trunks and the wet sheen on the pine needles. The memory hit him then, a sharp, unpleasant spike of sensation he had suppressed for 2 decades. When he was a boy, standing 100 yards from where the remains of the hiking group were found, the search and rescue crew had kept him shielded, but not entirely. He remembered the smell. Not the odor of decay, which had been bad enough, but something else, something under the human horror. It was a raw, primal odor that combined hot metal, like iron exposed to steam, with the smell of wet, unwashed animal fur. Rank, oily, and intoxicatingly terrifying. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the night air. The usual smells of pine, damp soil, and wood smoke residue were there. But beneath them, faint and fleeting, was a hint of that specific metallic tang. It was impossible to deny. The odor was too sharp, too immediate. It had not vanished. He paced the perimeter of his camp, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The ground here layered thick with decades of accumulated humus and fallen pine. As he moved, his toe kicked something beneath the damp litter. He knelt and brushed aside the decaying organic material. Beneath the dark topsoil, he felt a patch of hard, compacted earth. Embedded in it, nearly hidden by mud, were two parallel tracks. They were not tire marks. They were deep, wide indentations, separated by perhaps 4 feet. They looked as if a pair of enormous claws had been dragged along the ground, scraping deeply before disappearing into the brush line. He did not need the lantern to confirm the memory from 20 years ago. The last thing he remembered seeing that night before the search and rescue crew hustled him away were 2 impossibly gigantic, ragged shadows that had momentarily blotted out the light of the rescue helicopter's searchlight. 2 shadows, moving fast. Elias spent the rest of the night nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, anchoring himself in the known world. He was a rescuer, a man who dealt in the tangible physics of gravity, water pressure, and torn ligaments. Bears break branches, not trees. Wolves run in packs, not in singular enormous shadows. The sun finally broke the horizon, slicing through the canopy. The light made the metallic scent retreat, and the night's terror felt momentarily distant. He packed a small day bag and started hiking along the dried-up creek bed, forcing himself to move. About a mile upstream, the creek bed narrowed into a tight ravine choked with young aspen and silver birch. That is where he found it. It was not a branch broken by a clumsy animal or a storm. It was a young aspen, maybe 6 inches in diameter, sheared clean across. The bark was stripped back and the white pulp of the wood was exposed. The astonishing part was the height of the break, perfectly horizontal, exactly 7 feet above the ground. No bear, even a large grizzly, sheared a trunk with such clean force. The height required vertical reach and immense focused power. Elias ran his finger over the smooth, splintered wood. The break looked less like a crack and more like a massive pair of shears had been applied. He found no corresponding claw marks, no scrapes where the creature might have reached the break point. Then, just before the light began to turn amber with the coming of dusk, he saw the clearest evidence yet, imprinted perfectly in the damp silt at the edge of the water. It was a track, about 18 inches long and nearly a foot wide. It was clearly 5-toed, like a gigantic human handprint pressed into the mud. But where the fingers should have been, there were deep, broad depressions left by blunt, thick claws. The heel was heavy, wide, designed to support enormous vertical weight. The print was too fresh. The edges remained crisp, and water had not yet seeped into the depressions. Whatever had made it had been standing there maybe an hour ago, drinking. Elias raised his eyes slowly, following the sight line from the track to the opposite bank. The trees there were dark, dense pine, already falling into twilight shadow. The hair rose on the back of his neck, not because of fear, but because of sudden, stark certainty. The creature had not merely been here. It had chosen the edge of the creek where the shadows gathered fastest. It had not run away. It had simply stepped back into the gloom, patiently watching him confirm its terrifying existence. Elias was no longer an investigator. He was part of the landscape, and he was being observed. The game had changed, and the rules were not his. The subtle dread had turned solid, and it was moving toward him on two wide, clawed feet. He pulled the heavy pistol from his pack, the cool steel a comfort that lasted for exactly 1 second. It felt small, ludicrously small, against the sheer scale of the terror implied by that single perfect print. He knew with a certainty that reached down into his very bones that the past had not been erased. It had just been sleeping. The morning after finding the monstrous print, the forest performed its classic trick, returning to a state of manufactured innocence. The light filtered down, the humidity had burned off, and the place looked exactly like a postcard advertising weekend getaways. But the shift in Elias's perception was irrevocable. The woods were no longer a benign natural space. They were an immense, indifferent waiting room where the laws of nature bent into horrifying muscular shapes. His task now was twofold: survival and escape. He broke camp quickly, deciding to head back toward the major, if overgrown, trails. He knew enough about this county's geography to know that 4 miles west lay a popular though rugged backpacking route that sometimes saw traffic from university groups or dedicated hikers. The proximity of other people, however naive, was his only potential buffer. It was just past noon when he encountered them. 4 college students, 2 young men, 2 young women, lugging oversized packs that looked painfully new. They were loud, their conversation drifting ahead of them, punctuated by shrieks of laughter and the tinny, synthesized beat of music leaking from cheap earbuds. They smelled of sweat, synthetic fabric, and the sour, yeasty aroma of cheap beer, which they clearly tried to conceal. Their carelessness was unbearable in its innocence. "Hey, man, great weather, huh?" One of the young men called out, adjusting the straps on his pack. He wore bright blue hiking gear designed to be spotted by satellites. Elias stopped, blocking the path slightly. He kept his voice level, professional, the tone of the old search and rescue man explaining protocol. "You're deep in, folks. Way off the marked trail," Elias said. "You need to turn back. Head east until you hit the fire road." The second young man, taller and wearing a smug collegiate smirk, paused, pulling an earbud out. "Relax, Grandpa. We know what we're doing. We're heading for the old Hemlock Gorge. It is supposed to be totally pristine back there." "Listen to me," Elias insisted. The urgency mounting, the need to save them overriding the instinct to protect himself. He lowered his voice. "There is something out here. Something big. Not a bear. Nothing you have read about. It is moving fast, and it is active. You need to stay where there is traffic, stay together, and do not stop." The girl with the red bandana rolled her eyes openly. "Oh my God. Another cryptid story. Are you the guy who thinks the government hides Sasquatch in old munitions bunkers?" The smug kid laughed. "He is the local woods crank, Jeremy. Do not worry. We have bear spray, 3 flashlights, and enough granola to build a small house. We will be fine." Elias felt the exhaustion of 20 years of trying to explain the unexplainable well up in him. He could not protect people who actively refused protection. The guilt that flared quickly subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp bitterness. "Do what you want," he said, stepping aside. "But if you hear anything that does not sound like an animal, you run until your lungs burst, and you do not look back." They waved dismissively and marched past him, their synthetic packs rustling loudly. Their footsteps faded, carrying the scent of their obliviousness with them, heading straight for the places Elias now knew were saturated with ancient malice. He continued his westward retreat, putting miles between himself and the student group. He hiked until the sun was below the ridgeline, then made a cold camp without a fire, relying on his thick sleeping bag. The night was long, cold, and quiet, until 1:47 a.m. The sound that woke him was distant, faint, but unmistakable. It was a scream, pitched high and desperately human, ragged with terror. But it was not the sound of an extended struggle. The scream cut off abruptly, not faded, but instantly gone, as if someone had placed a thick, wet hand over the victim's mouth, or more chillingly, as if the victim's vocal cords had simply been severed mid-sound. A few seconds later, another deeper cry followed, cut short just as brutally. Then, absolute silence descended again. No movement, no crashing in the undergrowth, no triumphant roar of a predator. Just the heavy, humid blanket of the dark county air. Elias lay motionless, his hand gripping the heavy pistol until his knuckles were white. The silence that followed the cries was worse than any noise could have been. It suggested efficiency, not frenzy. He waited until the sky began to turn the bruised, pale color of pre-dawn before he moved. He knew intellectually that the screams had come from the direction the students had taken. He knew he should keep moving west, preserve his own fragile chance at getting out. But the training, the ingrained need to assess and report, dragged him toward the disturbance. He found their campsite 1.5 miles back, nestled in a small, dense grove of hemlocks near a stagnant pool of water. The ground was horrifyingly transformed. This was not the typical mess left by a bear or a coyote attack. The campsite looked less like it had been attacked and more like it had been plowed. The earth was churned up, the thick moss and grass ripped away in swaths, exposing the dark, wet soil beneath. It looked as if some heavy, unseen machine had driven tight circles through the area, dragging massive metal teeth. The tents were the starkest evidence of sheer, wanton violence. They were demolished. The fiberglass poles were snapped into 100 useless splinters. The synthetic nylon was not cut, but abraded, rubbed raw until the fibers had given way. One tent flap looked like coarse sandpaper had been applied to it repeatedly, until nothing remained but a gray, frayed mess. The corner stakes had been violently ripped from the ground, the guy lines snapped by raw, unbelievable force. There was blood. It was everywhere, yet strangely concentrated. It was not the fine spray of arterial injury. It was pooled, thick and viscous, soaking into the disturbed earth. Running away from the center of the camp, there was a drag mark. The mark was wide, the size of a flattened human torso, and it ran in a dark, uninterrupted line, disappearing into the thicket. Whatever had been dragged had been heavy, and the blood had trailed off steadily, suggesting a major, ongoing hemorrhage, or perhaps multiple sources bleeding out simultaneously. The sheer volume of the crimson stain against the dark, fungal ground made Elias lightheaded. It was the smell, too. Warm, coppery, sickly sweet, masking the cleaner smells of pine and decay. He stood there, breathing shallowly through his mouth, maintaining the professional detachment he had perfected years ago. Assess. Analyze. Do not feel. The attack had not been a frenzied, desperate rush for food. It was clinical, overwhelming destruction. The sheer power required to rip the tent stakes from the packed earth proved a muscle mass exceeding any indigenous species. It was an extermination. He followed the drag marks 20 feet into the brush, but the trail became too dense, the shadows too deep. He stopped himself, recalling the rules of search and rescue. Never become the victim. He had seen enough to know the conclusion of this story. As he backed away from the saturated ground, wiping his muddy hands uselessly on his damp jeans, he looked up, following the vertical line of the hemlock trunks. The shadows were deep and sharp. They pooled heavily in the understory, even in the morning light. He did not see it move, but he felt the sudden electric prickle of absolute certainty. He was being watched. He scanned the tree line slowly, trying to appear nonchalant, his hands loose at his sides. He saw nothing but the usual patterns of light and shade. But the silence had intensified again. The forest was holding its breath. Elias felt the cold dread settle deep in his spine. He had been so focused on the evidence on the ground, the remnants of the destruction, that he had failed to account for the predator's persistence. He was no longer tracking the past. The creature knew he had been here, and it knew he had witnessed the devastation. He had crossed a boundary. The hunter had been observed, and now, inexorably, the dynamic was reversed. Elias Vance was the new point of interest in the county's dark ecosystem. He moved slowly, deliberately, turning his back on the horrific scene, forcing himself to walk, not run, knowing that the thing in the shadows now had his scent, his pace, and his destination logged in its terrible, predatory intelligence. Elias moved with the focused, limping urgency of a man who knew his pursuer was better equipped, faster, and utterly relentless. He followed the winding secondary trails, using small streams to break his scent trail, constantly glancing back, fighting the urge to sprint. The air was heavy, the humidity rising, promising a hot, oppressive day that would only intensify the odors of the forest and the odor of the monster. It was early afternoon when he found her. She was one of the 2 young women from the student group, huddled against the massive, moss-covered roots of an ancient oak, maybe a quarter-mile from the scene of the previous night's massacre. She was alive, but barely. Her hiking shirt was shredded and soaked dark with blood and muck. Her eyes were wide, staring at a point 10 feet above his head. She did not react when he knelt beside her. She had 3 distinct, deep wounds, parallel lacerations, 6 or 7 inches long across her lower abdomen and one shoulder. They were impossibly precise and deep, tearing through muscle and skin alike. It was the kind of damage that suggested not simple teeth, but specialized curved weapons, claws designed for ripping. He pulled out his field dressing kit. "I need you to stay still. I am going to clean these, okay? I am a rescuer. I can help." She did not acknowledge the words. Her lips moved, making a dry, repetitive sound like small pieces of grit falling onto glass. "It did not run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of his own heavy breathing. "It just walked. So slow. We saw it, but it did not run." Elias leaned closer, his focus entirely on her face. "What did it look like? Talk to me." "It was listening," she continued, ignoring his question, her eyes still locked on the horror above them. "We were talking about the classes and the music And all the time it was just listening to us. She repeated the mantra. It did not run. It just walked, over and over, a broken, agonizing loop. The sheer terror in her description, the creature's slow, deliberate movement, its patient surveillance, was far more disturbing than any account of a frenzy. It implied calculated menace. As he started applying pressure to the abdominal wound, he heard it. A sound, not from the earth this time, but from the dense wall of dogwood and thistle perhaps 30 feet away. It was a series of quick, hard clicks, not the rustle of leaves or the snapping of a small twig underfoot, but a dry, hard clack, clack, clack. It sounded like massive joint knuckles hitting each other, or perhaps the rhythmic, eager closing of huge, bone-hard jaws. Elias froze, his heart seizing in his chest. He looked at the girl. She had stopped whispering. Her eyes, wide and empty, slowly turned to look toward the source of the noise. Then he saw the movement. Between the dense pine trunks, just beyond the screen of brush, a shadow coalesced. It was immense. Easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, even hunched. The bulk of it was astonishing. It was covered in thick, matted hair, black as crude oil and utterly absorbing the light. It stood upright, shifting its weight, balancing on impossibly heavy-looking back legs. The arms, they were unequivocally arms, were long, hanging nearly to the knees, ending in massive, multi-jointed fists. The metallic, oily scent hit Elias then, overpowering the smell of pine and blood. It was hot, humid, the stench of an overheating animal engine. The girl gave a final, soft, shuddering exhale. Her eyes went completely unfocused, and her small, fragile hold on life snapped. She was gone. The subtle noise of her passing seemed to attract the creature's full attention. It shifted its stance, turning its unseen face toward Elias. Elias acted on instinct, shoving his pack in front of him and drawing the heavy pistol. The heavy pistol felt like a child's toy in his hand. He registered, with a flash of icy terror, that the sun was still visible, high enough to be considered full daylight. The creature did not charge. It assessed him then with a speed that defied its obvious mass. It moved. It vanished behind a thick, mossy white pine. Elias waited for it to circle around. It did not. Instead, it reappeared instantly behind another tree, 10 yards further down the path. It had not run that distance. It had launched itself, covering the ground in a terrifying, blur-fast leap that momentarily defied gravity. Elias fired, twice. Blam, blam. The sound in the thick forest was deafening, yet laughably inadequate. He aimed for center mass where he estimated the chest to be, but the creature had already vanished behind the third tree. He saw a flash of movement high up, the quick shift of that oil-black shoulder. The smell intensified instantly. It was no longer a hint of metal and fur. It was a full sensory overload. It was the stench of a slaughterhouse floor on a 100-degree day, steam and guts and iron, mixed with the musky, overpowering aroma of adrenaline and ancient hunger. His vision swam momentarily, his system overwhelmed by the primal, aggressive odor. He waited, pistol raised, sweat dripping into his eyes, tasting the dust and fear. Silence. The creature was using the density of the trees like a shimmering veil. Elias searched for blood, any sign that his shots had connected, but the ground was already disturbed and shadowed. He heard no sound of retreat, no pained snarl. The creature was not running, it was stalking, deciding when and where the next leap would land. His rational mind was collapsing. He was a trained man, accustomed to dealing with apex predators, but this was outside the taxonomy of fear. This thing possessed the bulk of a bull elephant combined with the lightning speed of a striking snake. Worst of all, its behavior was not random. It was deliberate, tactical, using the cover and the shock of its appearance to its advantage. He waited for another 30 seconds, the silence feeling like hours. He felt the creature's presence, the massive heat signature radiating from the trees, but he could no longer see it. He knew he could not stay. To stand here, exposed, was to invite the final, quick pounce. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes glued to the last point of contact, his finger tight on the trigger. When he was perhaps 50 yards away, he risked a dash toward the thicket line. He glanced back once more. The clearing was empty. The creature had chosen to let him go, not out of fear, but predatory laziness. It had its meal. It did not need to chase the wounded small prey unless Elias became an immediate nuisance. The failure of his bullets, the sense that his meager defense had been ignored, was the final breaking point of his carefully constructed sanity. This was not a bear or a wolf. It was a dark, massive echo of humanity, a bipedal nightmare evolved for pure, efficient destruction. His rational mind had failed completely. He holstered the useless pistol and ran, propelled by a raw, ancient fear that had nothing to do with training or logic. Elias ran until his lungs burned and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He did not stop until he reached the only concrete landmark he knew existed in this deep, abandoned sector of the forest, the old State Fire Observation Tower. It stood sentinel on a small exposed ridge overlooking the surrounding county. It was a skeleton of rusting steel beams erected sometime in the late 1940s. The staircase was rickety, groaning under his weight, but the cabin at the top, though battered by 60 years of wind and ice, offered a view and a temporary sanctuary. He hauled himself onto the platform. The cabin was small, with windows mostly broken or covered by warped sheets of plywood. The air inside was cold, stale, and smelled strongly of dust, old wood, and the acrid metallic tang of generations of pigeon droppings. After forcing down a ration bar and checking his dwindling water supply, Elias began to scour the cabin for anything useful. Under a decaying wooden bench, beneath a thick carpet of dried guano, he found a battered metal footlocker. It was heavy, but the latch was rusted through. Inside were logs, journals kept by the various lonely fire watchers who had spent summers in this cage. They were bound in crumbling vinyl, spanning the years from 1957 onward. Elias began to read, driven by the desperate hope that some previous occupant had left a hint, a code, a solution. The entries for the late 1950s and early 1960s were tedious. Weather reports, equipment inventories, complaints about radio reception. But then, in 1962, the entries started to change. The handwriting, large and looping, became tight and hurried, scrawled on the margins of routine observations. October 3rd, 1962. Heavy dew, visibility 15 miles. Strange odor tonight, like burned oil and iron. Felt more than heard. October 6th, 1962. Found 200-pound buck ripped to pieces near the eastern logging road. Department of Natural Resources says bear attack, but the size of the bite marks, impossible. Felt watched all day. Total quiet. October 18th, 1962. They called off the search for the missing hunters, officially ruled misadventure. But the tracks, they were not deer, were not bear. They were tall, too tall. I am asking for a transfer. Elias paused, tracing the faded ink with his finger. Missing hunters, massive tracks, the odor. It was the same script, playing out 60 years ago. He flipped forward through the 60s and 70s. The journals returned to the mundane. The creature had seemingly vanished until 1982. The handwriting was different now, a crisp, neat script belonging to a man named Dale. September 29, 1982. Saw huge destruction down near the creek. Stressed out the local ranger. Department of Natural Resources is worried about a sudden population crash in the deer herds. No sign of wolves. October 10th, 1982. Heard the sounds again. That grinding vibration. It feels like the air is shaking, and the smell. I swore it was right below the tower last night, like walking into a rendering plant. October 24th, 1982. Search and rescue were out for the 3 missing college kids. They found the campsite. They are saying serial predator, but the sheer force involved. This thing is not human. It is built wrong. The same story. 20 years later. Elias sat back, a profound, gut-wrenching coldness spreading through his chest. He did not need to look at the next entry. He already knew. He flipped forward to the early 2000s. The entries were sparse, the tower having been decommissioned for routine use. But he found a private diary entry slipped between the log pages. October 1st, 2002. They finally found the remains of that hiking group. Kids from out of state. I knew it. The smell has been thick all week. It is back. The official conclusion at the time was that the creatures hated the light and never moved in the daylight. October 15th, 2002. They have shut down the Forest Service road, quarantining the county, saying it is some kind of rare viral outbreak in the wildlife. Lies. I saw the tracks myself, huge, bipedal. Elias felt a slow, terrible click in his mind. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. The trauma he had experienced as a boy occurred in October 2002. It was not a random event. It was not a curse, a random mutation, or a freak incident. It was an inexorable, terrifying schedule. A cycle. 20 years. It was now 2022. October was just beginning. The period of maximum activity, the time when the creature or creatures exerted themselves fully, was right now. This realization instantly sharpened the horror of the daytime attacks he had witnessed. The old rules, the supposed aversion to light, were utterly obsolete during the peak of the cycle. Elias felt a wave of icy resignation wash over him. He was no longer dealing with a fleeting monster of legend. He was dealing with biological inevitability. This thing existed. It obeyed laws of migration, population, and territory management. And those laws required, every 2 decades, a brutal, efficient cleansing of the upper county to secure their domain. The cold certainty was almost calming. The terror of the unknown had been replaced by the terror of the mathematically predictable. He had been born and raised in a territory that was, periodically, ceded to a higher, darker form of life. He looked out the cracked window of the tower cabin, scanning the green tapestry below. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch, now carried a new meaning. It was not just background noise. It was an event, timed precisely by the invisible clock of the cycle. The creature was not just around the county. It was in control of the county, and he was violating its temporal lease. The paranoia settled in deep, sharp, and persistent. He was not safe just because he was high up. He was visible. He had violated the rules of the land, and the land was now following its horrific schedule to rectify the trespass. He moved slowly, methodically, barricading the broken windows with the rotten plywood, knowing that mere wood would not stop the creature, but hoping the psychological barrier would buy him a moment's notice. As the sun began to dip, painting the eastern sky in sickly oranges and bruised purples, Elias understood his true situation. He was not fighting a solitary nightmare, but a synchronized, scheduled event, and the clock was ticking down to the peak of the 20-year cycle, when the killing would be at its most intense, efficient, and complete. He was trapped in the jaws of a biological calendar, and the next 2 weeks were going to be brutal. Elias spent the night in the fire tower, alternating between catnapping and staring out into the pitch-black void, his senses heightened to an unbearable pitch. The wind sighed through the steel lattice, mimicking footsteps, making the wood frame groan like ancient bones. The low-frequency rumble did not return, but the silence felt pregnant, expectant. Just as the first gray light of dawn was washing out the stars, he heard them. 3 distinct, rapid shots from a heavy-caliber rifle, followed quickly by a 4th, more frantic shot. Hope, sharp and reckless, surged through him. Other people. Armed people. He scrambled down the rickety ladder, ignoring the protesting groans of the metal, and headed toward the sound. The shots had come from the direction of the old reservoir road, a place where local men often set up semi-permanent hunting camps during the early season. He moved quickly, driven by the chance of alliance, but dread held him in check. Those were not the celebratory shots of a successful hunt. They were the desperate, failing sounds of a defense. He found the camp about 1.5 miles later, nestled in a small hollow protected by boulders. It was carnage, but different from the student massacre. This was a battle, short and decisive, between prepared men and overwhelming force. The fact that this attack had occurred at dawn and had been so overwhelmingly brutal confirmed the breaking of the old doctrine. Immunity granted by the sun was a myth of the past. The first hunter lay near the remains of the fire pit, his body brutally damaged. He looked less like he had been mauled and more like he had been dropped from the height of the fire tower onto solid rock. His chest cavity had collapsed, and his limbs bent at unnatural, sickening angles. Elias quickly scanned the area for movement, pistol drawn. The scent of hot blood and ozone was thick in the morning air, almost masking the metallic stench of the predator. He spotted the second man, older, with a shock of gray hair matted with sweat and dirt. He was slumped against a rocky outcrop, still alive, attempting to hold a blood-soaked piece of flannel to a massive, oozing wound in his side. Elias rushed to him. "Do not move! I am here! What happened? Where did it go?" The man's eyes were wide, vacant, staring past Elias into the trees. He was not focused on rescue. He was trying to articulate the impossible. Elias pressed the man's hand to the wound, trying to keep the internal pressure up. Did not hear it coming, the man choked out, a bubbling rattle in his chest. We were talking about the season. Then it was just there. Elias leaned in close. What was it? Tell me. The hunter struggled for air, a look of profound horror fixed on his face, the last image his memory would hold. Not a wolf, not a cat. It stood, like us, but huge. And the hands. He struggled against the pain. It had a chest like a man, wide as a refrigerator. And the hands. He did not finish the thought. The life went out of his eyes, the terror settling into a permanent icy mask. He did not survive the night's encounter. Elias slowly lowered the man's limp hand. He felt a detached fury, not just at the slaughter, but at the absolute violation of the natural order that these creatures represented. They were a mockery of bipedal life, a dark evolutionary branch that should not exist. He took his time, using the pale daylight to conduct a thorough analysis of the scene, something the fading rescue specialist in him insisted on doing. He found the impact point. A patch of soft mud near the hunter's collapsed blind held the undeniable imprint of the creature's full mass. By the depth of the indentation, Elias estimated the thing's weight at least 500 pounds. The broad, five-toed feet confirmed his earlier observation. The impression also revealed a long, thick depression running behind the heel. Evidence of a substantial tail used for balance and leverage, essential for rapid vertical movement. The rifle belonging to the deceased hunter lay nearby. Elias picked it up. It was a heavy bolt-action rifle, built to handle powerful cartridges. Running down the steel barrel were 3 deep parallel gouges. They were not superficial scrapes. The metal yielded like butter under the immense pressure of its claws. This was a creature built like a war machine, operating with the speed of a sprinter. Its strength was structural, not just muscular. It was the ultimate end-stage predator, evolved to stand vertical, freeing its specialized hands for grasping, tearing, and crushing. As Elias collected the remaining ammunition and a good flashlight from the camp stores, he noticed a shift in the acoustic atmosphere. The clicking sound he had heard the day before was back. Now it was no longer random or isolated. It came from 2 distinct locations in the dense surrounding forest. And it had rhythm. Click, click, click. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like knuckles being popped, or a slow, measured step. It was the creature moving, and it was getting closer, no longer hiding its advance. The hunter's blood was thick, fresh, and alluring. Elias was now a moving meal, covered in the residual metallic scent of the violence he had investigated. The aggression of the forest intensified immediately. Elias felt the predator's odor grow heavier, more concentrated. It was not just the smell of musk and animal. It was the sharp, charged aroma of focused intent, the hot, volatile scent of pleasure in the hunt. He had gathered his meager resources. He had to move. He began his retreat toward the nearest shelter he could remember, an old, sturdy Forest Service cabin near a small, unnamed lake a couple of miles north. As he moved away from the camp, sticking to the higher ground, the rhythm of the clicks increased slightly, keeping pace with his stride. He looked back and saw a heavy, dark shadow move quickly between 2 pines. Too fast, too large to be an illusion. They were following him. And this time, they were not waiting for the cover of night. The hunter's sacrifice had simply provided the day's meal, and now the creature or creatures were focused on the next target. Elias knew the cold certainty of the cycle was upon him. He was being ushered toward the next confrontation, his heartbeat counting the steps until the inevitable arrival. Elias pushed himself hard, the adrenaline overriding the fatigue and the persistent aches in his 40-year-old body. He reached the cabin just before dusk. It was a single-story structure, built of heavy, rotting timbers, situated in a shallow clearing near the edge of a small, mosquito-infested lake. It had been used by rangers decades ago, but was long since abandoned, the windows either broken out or boarded over with thin, weathered plywood. He immediately began barricading. He did not have much to work with: a few moldering tables, a rusty wood stove, and his own meager pack. He shoved the tables against the door, jamming the handles with heavy pieces of debris, and used the defunct stove as a central anchor point for the door barricade. It was clumsy, imperfect work, but it bought him time and required the creature to apply significant, audible force to breach the threshold. Night fell swiftly, bringing with it the familiar heavy air of the county. Elias sat in the profound darkness of the cabin, the stale air thick with the smell of mold and lake mud. He kept his pistol out, though he had little faith in its stopping power. He did not have to wait long. The movement began outside, slow and methodical. He heard the crush of pine needles under heavy weight, the sound circling the small structure. Then, the sickening realization. It was not one set of footsteps. Elias pressed his ear against the rotting wood of the wall, concentrating. He distinguished 3 separate heavy walking patterns. One was slower, more ponderous, likely the biggest of the group. Another was quick, almost shuffling, favoring the outer edge of the clearing. The third was stealthy, the weight distributed more carefully, moving close to the cabin foundation. They did not howl. They did not roar in primal fury. They simply walked. They circled the structure like engineers surveying a flawed design. This was the terrifying refinement of the creature's intelligence. They were not just brute predators. They were tactical hunters. The movement stopped near one of the plywood-covered windows. Elias heard a slight ragged breath drawn, a dry rasping sound. Then, silence. Absolute unsettling silence that stretched the seconds into minutes. He knew what they were doing. They were listening for his breathing, for the telltale sounds of panic, for the shift of his weight on the old floorboards. Then came the proof of their intelligence. At the main door, where he had erected his clumsy barricade, he heard a slight click. It was not a claw hitting the wood. It was the sound of the creature testing the mechanism. Through a small gap in the warped floorboards, Elias was able to shine his tiny flashlight beam downward, illuminating the edge of the door. A limb was visible. It was not a paw. It was a massive, dark, articulated appendage, ending in wide, thick fingers tipped with those blunt, horrifying claws. And in a motion that was unnervingly human, the creature lifted one of its fingers and delicately nudged the rusty metal handle of the door. It was not a desperate attempt to scratch its way in. It was a calculated, curious test of the barrier. It was trying to figure out how the human mechanism worked. The pure, raw horror of that intelligent gesture sent a fresh wave of panic through Elias. These creatures were not driven solely by hunger or instinct. They were learning. They were adapting. They remembered the failure of the students' plastic tents and the efficacy of the hunter's heavy wooden door, and they were trying to apply that knowledge. Elias held his breath, waiting for the inevitable, brutal force that would smash the door inward. But it did not come. Instead, the presence at the door retreated. The footsteps moved back, circling the cabin again. 5 hours passed in that absolute vacuum of sound. 5 hours of suffocating, total silence, broken only by the deafening sound of Elias's own pulse hammering in his ears. The waiting was worse than any attack. The creatures demonstrated a patience that was utterly unnatural for an animal driven by metabolic necessity. They were simply waiting for his inevitable mistake, for exhaustion to claim him. Then, the floor started to vibrate. It was a low, heavy resonance coming from directly above him. One of the creatures, the largest one he estimated, had found a way to scramble onto the low-slung, rotten roof. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, its massive weight causing the old shingles and timbers to creak in protest. It was searching, Elias realized, for a structural weakness, a stovepipe hole, or an unvented gap in the roofing where it could see or smell inside. He imagined the creature lying prone on the mossy roof, its oily black fur merging with the darkness, its massive, ugly head pressed against the wood, listening to the tiny sounds of the vulnerable prey hiding inside. Elias backed away from the center of the room, crouching under a thick beam, making himself as small as possible. The darkness inside the cabin was total, oppressive, a tangible pressure on his eyes. He knew the darkness functioned as their primary weapon, the source of their superior speed and vision. If he stayed immobile, silent, they would eventually find a way in, or simply wait for him to starve or succumb to thirst. He needed a defense that was not just physical. He needed to find a weakness, a flaw in their terrifying biology that matched the flaw in his own humanity. The clock of the 20-year cycle was running out, and the siege had begun. He had to find a way to flip the natural order of the hunt, or he would not survive the dawn. The creature remained on the roof for 1 hour, moving with agonizing slowness, testing the structural integrity of the old cabin. Elias, huddled beneath the thickest support beam, focused desperately on the fire tower logs, dredging up any forgotten piece of information. The previous rangers had all mentioned the same thing. The intense activity occurred exclusively at night. Daylight, however gloomy, provided immunity. A flicker of memory from the 2002 entry. The old journal entry stated that the creatures hated the light and never moved in the daylight. Elias thought of the hyper-specialized night vision the creatures must possess, eyes engineered for the absolute blackness of the deep forest, allowing them to track by the faintest starlight. Such hypersensitivity came at a cost. Photophobia, extreme aversion to bright, directed light. It was not a magical weakness. It was a biological defect. He remembered seeing something useful when he first entered the shack. In a corner, buried beneath old fishing nets and mildewed rope, was a heavy, industrial-sized floodlight, the kind used by repair crews working on lake docks at night. It was bulky, powered by a massive 12-volt marine battery that was currently disconnected. The challenge was not finding the light. It was getting it connected and operational without making too much noise. Elias moved painstakingly slowly, inching toward the corner. The massive weight on the roof shifted directly above him, the ceiling creaking as the creature followed the minute sounds of his movement. He retrieved the light and the battery. The connections were corroded, requiring him to scrape away rust with his knife. The process took 20 minutes, each scrape feeling like a thunderclap in the cabin's oppressive silence. Finally, the connection was secure. He had one shot. He aimed the heavy light toward the weakest point of the cabin, the main door, which was barricaded but had a few sizable cracks between the planks. He flipped the heavy-duty switch, The floodlight roared to life. The beam was an intense, piercing white column of light, focused and brutal. He wedged the light carefully, positioning the beam to shoot directly through the largest horizontal crack in the door barricade, creating a dazzling horizontal streak of pure radiance across the clearing outside. The immediate reaction was not what he expected. Not a roar of fury, but a sudden, panicked chaos. The creature that had been on the roof made a startlingly high-pitched, distressed sound. A sharp, almost rodent-like cry that was jarringly high for its massive size. The heavy vibrations on the roof ceased instantly. He heard the enormous weight scramble backward, scraping along the shingles, and then a heavy thud as it dropped awkwardly to the ground. The sound of movement outside became frenzied, chaotic. Elias crept to a splintered hole in the side window and peered out. In the piercing white beam of the floodlight he saw two figures. They were large, dark silhouettes, and they were moving not with predatory grace but with clumsy, panicked haste. One creature had its massive, clawed hands clapped tightly over where its eyes should be, retreating rapidly, tripping over a tree root before disappearing into the thick shadow line 100 feet away. The light had caused physical pain, disorienting and repelling them. Elias felt a profound rush of exhausted relief. It was not the final answer, but it was a crucial tactical advantage. The light did not kill the monsters, but it neutralized their superior senses and established a psychological boundary. He repositioned the floodlight so that the beam fixed on the area immediately outside the main entrance. The brilliant white pillar of light formed a 20-foot diameter perimeter of safety. This was not a magical ward against evil. It was exploiting a specialized sensory organ. The creature's intense adaptation to the dark had rendered it highly vulnerable to focused illumination. For the first time since returning to the county, Elias felt a shift in the power dynamic. He was no longer just running, he was fighting, using the resources of the known world, electricity, engineering, and common biological knowledge, against the horrors of the unknown. But the relief was tempered by the constant low thrum of the battery. It was old, and it would not last the night. Through the crack in the door, he watched the tree line. He knew they were still out there. They had not fled the county. After about 40 minutes of silence, they reappeared, cautiously. They stayed well back, keeping to the absolute edges of the shadows cast by the surrounding pines. They moved slowly, their black forms barely discernible against the blackness of the forest, occasionally stopping to stare into the light, their deep-set eyes watering from the intensity. They were patient. They knew the light was temporary. They were simply waiting for the battery to die, for the fuel to run out, or for Elias to make a mistake and step into the welcoming dark. Their patience was the most terrifying aspect of their intelligence. The sun rose, transforming the intimidating white beam of the floodlight into a useless pale column. The immediate danger receded with the darkness, but the creature's lingering scent, that sickly metallic tang, remained heavy in the morning air, a promise of the coming night. Elias spent the early morning hours checking the battery, which was nearly dead, and surveying the perimeter. The large black shapes were gone, having retreated into the deep dark cover the daylight provided them. Just before 9 a.m., he heard the noise of civilization, clumsy and loud, approaching from the lake. a small motorboat sputtering across the water, followed by the raucous sounds of human ignorance. 3 men, obviously out-of-towners, judging by their crisp new fishing gear and their inability to handle a small craft. They brought with them large coolers, loud radios, and a casual air of invasive tourism. They beached the boat 50 yards from the cabin, oblivious to the signs of struggle and the lingering odor of carnage. Elias, exhausted and limping, exited the cabin, waving his arms. He had to warn them. "Hey, you guys, stop right there. You need to leave. Now." The fishermen looked up, annoyed by the interruption. One, a heavy-set man wearing a baseball cap advertising a major beer brand, shielded his eyes from the sun. "What's your deal, man? This is public land. We are just setting up camp." Elias pointed toward the torn earth and the still-present horrible impressions left by the creature's feet. He kept his voice tight and authoritative. "There are large, aggressive predators in this area. Not bears, something else. They attacked 2 camps in the last 2 days. You need to pack up and get out." The baseball cap man laughed, a loud booming sound that sounded obscene in the silent woods. "Look, pal, you look pretty strung out. Have you been sampling too much local moonshine? I am here to catch some bass, not listen to cryptid stories." He tried explaining the cycle, the 20-year schedule, the sheer size and speed of the things. But the fishermen were immune to anything that contradicted their belief in the benign nature of the weekend getaway. "You are crazy, man," the second fisherman, younger and thinner, muttered. "Maybe you are the aggressive predator we need to worry about." Then the heavy-set man made the fatal decision. He unslung a hunting rifle from his shoulder, intending to prove his courage to the crazy hermit. "All right, look. If you are so sure there is a big bad wolf, I will go flush him out," he declared, swaggering toward the tree line. "I will show you what a real predator looks like." Elias yelled a final, useless warning, but the man had already disappeared into the dense cover. The man's bravado lasted exactly 5 minutes. Then came the scream. It was not the drawn-out wail of the student. It was a choked, wet sound of realization and immediate, overwhelming pain. It was cut short by a sound like a wet branch snapping. The 2 remaining fishermen froze, their casual amusement evaporating instantly, replaced by sheer gut-wrenching terror. They looked at Elias, the realization of his terrible truth dawning in their wide eyes. "What was that?" the thinner man whispered, his face ash-gray. "Your friend just did not survive the encounter," Elias said flatly. "I told you. Now, we run. We go back to the boat." But panic had already claimed them. Instead of retreating, they snatched up their own rifles, driven by a chaotic mix of fear and primal need for vengeance. "No, we are not running," the second man shouted, tears streaming down his face. "We have to find him. We have to destroy the thing that took him." They became liabilities, running in circles, shouting, their movements jerky and unpredictable. Their panic was a beacon. Elias felt the air shift. The low, deep pressure of the creature's attention returned, thicker and more immediate than before. The creatures, sensing fresh prey and utter disarray, became bold. From the dark tree line, the sound began, a low, terrifying reverberation that sounded like the sustained roar of a distant massive steam boiler increasing in volume, a sound specifically designed to induce terror and paralysis. One creature emerged. It was moving with terrifying confidence, no longer hiding. This was full, undeniable morning light, yet the creature was fully engaged and hunting, proving absolutely that the rules of 20 years past no longer held any sway. It ignored the smaller, weaker beam of one of the fishermen's handheld lanterns. It was too aggressive, too hungry, too assured of its victory to care about minor irritations. The struggle was brutally brief. The panicked fisherman raised his rifle. The creature swiped low. The force of the blow was so immense that the man did not just drop the weapon. The steel barrel of the rifle bent against the rock as he flew sideways, his body crumpling. Elias had his back to the chaos already running. He was not focused on revenge. He was focused on survival. In the midst of the mayhem, as he fled past a densely overgrown patch of wild blackberry, he noticed something critical. Beneath the tangle of vines, he saw the faint gray scarring of an old dirt track. A wider, more defined road, overgrown but still structurally intact, leading away from the lake and toward the eastern ridge. It was the forgotten route of the original search and rescue teams 20 years ago, a path specifically designed for emergency extraction. That was his path out. But he had to make it to the hard-packed center before the creatures, now fully engaged in their hunt, realized he was attempting an escape rather than a stand. He ran, ignoring the screams behind him, the sound of the churning water as the boat was overturned, and the sharp, hot stench of the inevitable. Elias plunged onto the old, overgrown access road, the sharp ends of the blackberry canes tearing at his jacket and jeans. The road was barely discernible, a faint indentation in the forest floor, but the surface underneath was solid enough for speed. The thick, wet sound of destruction faded behind him, replaced by the relentless, rhythmic clack-clack of the creatures pursuing him. He was running straight into a classic tactical trap. He had covered perhaps a quarter mile when the first creature, the massive tall one, appeared on the road behind him. It was not sprinting, it was loping, its long, heavy legs covering ground with terrifying ease. Its sole purpose was to act as a funnel, driving him forward along the cleared path. Elias risked a glance to his right. There, moving with impossible stealth through the dense thicket, was the second creature, shorter, broader, clearly designed for flanking maneuvers. It was moving parallel to him, cutting off any potential escape route toward the winding creek bed he knew lay a few hundred yards to the north. He was being herded. The third creature, the sneakiest one, he did not see until it was too late. He should have known. The cycle was always composed of 3 primary elements, 3 shadows of the nightmare. He was already exhausted, his muscles screaming for oxygen when his foot caught on a thick, exposed root. He fell hard, the air knocked from his lungs, his meager pistol skittering uselessly into the underbrush. As he struggled to push himself back up, the flanking creature burst from the thicket. It did not lunge for his neck or torso. It delivered a quick surgical strike, a massive clawed hand sweeping down across his lower thigh. The pain was immediate, incandescent, overriding all other sensory input. It was not a bite, but a ripping laceration. He felt the fabric of his denim jeans instantly wick warm and wet. He heard the sound of the tear, a horrible, moist, slurping sound, as the claws sliced through skin and muscle. He yelled, a choked, agonizing sound, and rolled, grabbing for the massive gash. The creature did not linger. Its function was complete. neutralize the mobility of the prey. It retreated slightly, returning to its flanking position, satisfied that the escape had been disabled. Elias was left lying in the churned dirt, the massive burning pain of the wound paralyzing him. He heard the thudding steps of the lead creature getting closer, and the quick, sharp sounds of the two others converging on the road. He could not stand. The leg was pumping blood warm and sickeningly fast. He had to move. He began to crawl, pulling himself forward with his elbows and his healthy leg, dragging the useless, rapidly bleeding wound behind him. Each movement sent a blinding flash of agony through his system, making him dizzy and nauseated. The creatures were not rushing. They were walking slowly now, enjoying the certainty of the kill. He heard the gravel crunch under their colossal feet, just 10 feet behind him. Then the weather turned. A sudden, violent thunderclap shook the forest canopy. The sky, which had been gray, opened up with the immediate cold fury of a mountain storm. Rain poured down, heavy and thick, transforming the dry dust into instant mud. The cold shock of the rain hitting his bare skin and his open wound was brutal, but the sound was salvation. The deluge was deafening, muffling the sounds of the creature's heavy footsteps. And the heavy water flow instantly began to wash away the sticky, coppery scent of his own blood, scrambling his trail. He did not think about the cycle or the nature of the monsters. His mind narrowed to the pure animal necessity of forward movement. Next foot, next yard. The pain in his leg was a raw, burning focus, but the overwhelming instinct to live pushed him onward, crawling through the mud, using the roar of the storm as a temporary, glorious shield against the silence of the hunt. He had to find shelter, a place to patch the wound, and most importantly, a reliable source of light, because the night was coming, and the rain would not mask his presence forever. The desperate, mud-crawling flight lasted for perhaps 20 minutes before the storm began to abate, softening to a cold, steady drizzle. Elias dragged himself off the main path and into a cluster of defunct concrete structures. This was the old Forest Service maintenance station, abandoned since the 1970s. It was a cluster of 3 small sheds and a larger, dilapidated garage, its doors warped and hanging on rusty hinges. He pulled himself into the main garage bay, its floor scattered with rusted tools, oily rags, and the sharp, invigorating smell of dried motor oil and decades of dust. He leaned against a wall, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His priority was the wound. He stripped off his soaked, torn jeans, his vision momentarily blurring from the pain and blood loss. The laceration was deep, running from the upper thigh to the knee, but thankfully it was not gushing uncontrollably. He used the remnants of a clean T-shirt to create a pressure bandage, tying it fiercely tight, ignoring the agony. As the pain stabilized slightly, his mind returned to the pattern. He looked out of a high, dusty window. The clouds were parting, and the moon, a huge, sickly orange disk, was already nearly full. He recalled the dates from the fire tower log. The activity peaked not on the full moon, but slightly before, during the height of its power. Elias, the detached search and rescue specialist, performed an intellectual dissection of the horror. The 20-year cycle was not arbitrary or magical. It was a biological imperative, a population spike followed by a mandatory culling and dispersal. This territory, this county, was their ancestral breeding ground. They needed space. Every 20 years, their numbers reached a critical mass. and they had to conduct an ecological control measure. The human population was their competitor. Humans built roads, established permanent settlements, and interfered with the creature's massive movements. By eliminating the visible human presence in the deep woods, the campers, the hikers, the hunters, they were clearing the way for a generation of new creatures to scatter and establish territories elsewhere. It was a dark, ruthless form of migration management. The periods of silence, Elias realized, were not periods of rest. They were periods of maximum observation, of energy conservation. When the metabolic pressure, the hunger, the need to breed, the drive to clear the competition hit its peak, they exploded in activity, leading to the devastating weeks of October. He found a fuel tank still containing residual, sludgy diesel, and better yet, a massive, rusted diesel generator tucked away under a heavy tarp. It was ancient but built like a battleship. He worked quickly, priming the generator with the old diesel. The oil felt sticky and rank on his hands, but the urgency of the moment outweighed the risks. He had to make noise. He needed light. With a heavy pull on the crank, the machine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. The sound was immense. A steady, booming thrum of diesel power that instantly shattered the oppressive silence of the forest. The noise was a weapon, but a double-edged one. It guaranteed that every creature within a 5-mile radius knew exactly where Elias Vance was. But noise also disoriented. It was a constant, unnatural intrusion on the creature's hypersensitive hearing. Elias had found what he needed: the infrastructure to establish a sustained, large-scale source of light. He was not going to fight them with a pistol. He was going to fight them with pure industrial-grade light pollution. He found 2 massive metal-caged construction floodlights, the same kind of powerful halogen units used for highway construction, and enough heavy-duty cable to string them up. He pressed a burning, oily rag briefly against the still-weeping wound on his leg, searing the edge of the cut in a crude, desperate attempt to cauterize the worst of the capillary bleed. The blinding pain was a useful focus. His body was a wreck of adrenaline and fever, but his mind was crystal clear. The game was no longer about survival in the darkness. It was about controlling the light. He knew they were coming, drawn by the sound of the generator like moths to a destructive flame. He was ready for the final, inevitable confrontation with the schedule of the cycle. Elias worked through the night, driven by the roar of the generator and the burning ache in his leg. He managed to hang the 2 powerful construction floodlights from the steel beams of the garage entrance. He angled them strategically, creating 2 intersecting cones of blinding white light that encompassed the front of the station and cast fierce, hard shadows into the surrounding woods. The lights hummed, buzzing with electricity and heat, painting the immediate perimeter in a hyper-real, almost sterile white. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The constant thrumming of the diesel engine, combined with the brilliant focused light, acted as a repellent, but also as a definitive declaration of war. The response from the darkness was swift. The low, rumbling growls returned, but this time they were not 3 separate noises. They were a chorus, a deep, guttural symphony of displeasure coming from multiple directions. Elias strained his ears against the generator noise, counting. He estimated at least 5, possibly 6, different sources of sound. The small scouting party he had been dealing with had been joined by reinforcements. The cycle was reaching its absolute peak. The pack, or family unit, moved in. They did not rush the light. They approached like a slow black tide, moving from the dense tree line to the absolute boundary of the light's influence. Elias watched them. They were gigantic, hulking shapes, darker than the night itself, their forms occasionally catching the light just enough to reveal the oily sheen of their thick fur. They used every available piece of cover: the stump of a fallen tree, a dense stand of young birch, the slight elevation of a nearby boulder, as armor. They pressed against the invisible electric fence of the light, their deep-throated growls vibrating the cold concrete floor. Elias stood behind the heavy generator, his pistol resting on a stack of oily tools. He knew they were testing his resolve, waiting for him to blink, to falter, or most critically, to run out of fuel. He calculated his remaining resources. The diesel tank was half full. At this consumption rate, he had perhaps 6 hours of sustained light. If he stayed, he was simply deferring the inevitable. When the lights went out, the creatures would be instantly on him, their night vision returning in a terrifying rush of predatory advantage. He could not win the siege. He could only leverage the moment to facilitate an escape. The decision was made with a cold, clear finality. He had to use the light as a cover, a sacrificial distraction. He carefully strapped his gear to his back, securing his pistol and his meager first aid kit. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench, feeling the satisfying weight in his hand, a final, close-quarter tool. He knew the secondary path out of the station, a narrow, barely used track leading out the back, away from the intense light of the generator, heading east toward the paved county roads. He paused at the edge of the dark rear exit. The back of the station was plunged into complete darkness, a risky gamble. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. The storm was coming back, the first fat drops of rain hitting the roof. The drumming of the generator was his shield. He turned and pushed open the rear door. Stepping out into the rain-slicked dark, the transition was shocking. The roaring light from the front of the station seemed impossibly distant. He was immediately enveloped by the dense, wet blackness of the forest, the rain now falling in sheets, muffling his footsteps in the mud. He moved silently, ignoring the shooting pain in his leg, following the barely visible track. The cold rain was a gift, washing away his trail, diluting his scent, and suppressing the metallic odor of the hunting pack. He did not look back until he reached a slight rise in the ground, 70 yards away, where a break in the pines offered a final view of the maintenance station. The scene was surreal, terrifyingly beautiful. The abandoned structure was bathed in the blinding, pulsing white of the floodlights, the diesel engine thrumming its mechanical heartbeat. And surrounding that halo of manufactured light, standing like ancient black statues, were the creatures. 5 or 6 of them, impossibly large, frozen at the threshold of the illumination. They were silhouettes of pure kinetic power, unable to advance, only able to watch the source of their pain. Elias did not break his stride. He left the lights burning, the generator roaring, a beacon of defiance. He was running toward the paved world, pursued not by individual nightmares, but by a relentless biological clock. He was out of the heart of the siege, but he knew the county line was still miles away, and he had to keep moving until the asphalt was under his feet. Elias pushed through the last dense thicket of scrub oak, his wounded leg screaming in protest. He was moving on pure, raw instinct, guided only by the change in the feel of the ground beneath his worn boots. He stumbled out of the woods and fell onto the crunching, gritty surface of a hard-packed gravel road. It was a secondary county route rarely traveled, but undeniably man-made, a path of civilization. He felt the sharp stones press into his hands, and the sudden texture of organized, managed land was the most comforting sensation he had experienced in days. He dragged himself into the center of the road, too exhausted to move further. He lay there, his body shivering from the fever and the cold dampness, waiting for the first sign of dawn. The generator's thrum was still faintly audible in the distance, a dull, repetitive pulse of manufactured life. A little over 1 hour later, as the light turned a faint, ethereal gray, he heard the sound of a heavy diesel engine approaching, not the roar of the generator, but the deep, sustained rumble of a working vehicle. A long-haul logging truck, stacked high with fresh-cut pine, barreled down the road. It braked hard when the driver spotted the prone figure, the air brakes hissing loudly. The driver, a massive man with a dark beard and a stained flannel shirt, climbed down. He took one look at Elias, the torn, blood-soaked clothing, the wild, vacant terror in his eyes, the deep claw marks on his leg, and did not ask a single question about bears or camping accidents. He was a man who had seen enough of the wrong things in the deep woods to know that some questions did not need asking. "Get in, mister," the trucker said, his voice low and gruff. "I am heading toward the town limits. Get in the jump seat." Elias nodded, unable to speak, and struggled to pull himself up into the cab. As the truck shifted gears and began to pick up speed, heading down the county road, Elias watched the forest recede. The trees, once again, looked calm, normal, bathed in the soft, unthreatening light of the rising sun. The forest performed its perfect trick. The banality of the morning light functioned as a monstrous, sophisticated lie. He knew the script now. When they reached the nearest town, he would face the police, the hospital staff, the inevitable barrage of questions. He rehearsed his answers in his mind. Bear attack. Fell on a barbed wire fence. Got lost. Bad luck. No one would believe the truth. The 20-year cycle, the calculated intelligence, the creatures who tested doorknobs. He needed the world to remain safe and contained. And to tell the truth was to shatter the fragile illusion of control. As the truck merged onto the main asphalt highway, the rhythm of the road steady and fast beneath the tires, Elias leaned his head back, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion. He had escaped the county's core. The gut-wrenching realization took hold. He had not defeated the horror. He had simply run from the epicenter of its scheduled activity. The fear was not contained in the forest. The horror was simply on a timeline. The bitter truth was distilled. They did not disappear. They simply retreated, satisfied with the results of their cleansing. They are patient, they are efficient, and they are organized. 20 years sounds like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, 20 years passes faster than you think. The logging truck's forward-facing dash camera recorded a final, horrifying detail. As the truck hit the 10th mile marker past the county line, deep in the shadows of the tree line running parallel to the highway, a large, dark figure emerged momentarily from the woods. It was massive, black, and bipedal. It ran alongside the speeding truck with impossible, fluid grace, keeping pace with the 45-mile-per-hour vehicle for a sustained period, holding to the absolute boundary of the light cast by the approaching sun. The figure did not stop until the truck had crossed the invisible jurisdictional boundary. Then, it stopped, standing motionless for a long moment, simply observing the machine and the injured man inside, before turning slowly and melting back into the shadows of the forest. It was not a conclusion to the season. It was simply the completion of a survey. They knew the boundaries now, and they knew the means of escape, and they were already waiting for the next scheduled rendezvous.